you, Chairman Chaffetz and Ranking Member Cummings and members of the committee for inviting me to testify today. You've asked me to focus on the urgent need for postal reform legislation and the provisions that we believe are necessary. I'm pleased to do that today, but before I do, it's important that we take a moment to recognize the current reality of the Postal Service. It is no longer 2009 when the Great Recession sent mail volume plummeting and the pre-funding mandate crushed the Postal Service's finances, raising doubts in some quarters about the viability of the agency. Postal employees never doubted the viability of the Postal Service, but we worked hard to help the service to adapt and survive as it shed more than 200,000 jobs, and we boosted productivity dramatically. The Postal Service has returned to operational profitability, now earning $4.4 billion over the past 2.5 years. Our pension funds are healthy and better funded at 92% than most private sector pensions, and we have set aside some $50 billion for retiree health when most large private companies have not set aside a dime. Thanks to the growth of direct mail and booming e-commerce, total mail volume recovered and stabilized in 2015, increasing the Postal Service's revenue to $69 billion. There's no question that the Postal Service remains a vital part of the nation's economic infrastructure. In 2015, we delivered more than 150 billion letters, magazines, and packages, 6 and even 7 days a week. The Postal Service's revenue is just a small part of the $1.4 trillion of GDP accounted for by the U.S. mailing industry, which now employs 7.5 million Americans. With an 84% approval rating for the American people, we believe the Postal Service can thrive in the 21st century with the right public policies. Now is not the time to weaken this treasured agency through service and delivery reductions, especially those that have failed to attract congressional support in the past. Instead, this committee should offer sensible and targeted reforms that will provide financial stability and allow the Postal Service to innovate. Specifically, it should address 3 specific legislative and regulatory burdens that severely hinder the Postal Service. First, the Postal Service is required to massively fund future retiree health premiums decades in advance, regardless of financial conditions facing the agency or the country. No other public or private enterprise in America faces such a mandate, and most firms don't pre-fund at all. This mandate by itself accounts for nearly 90% of all reported losses since 2007. NALC has suggested numerous ways to address the pre-funding mandate over the years. As part of an overall reform effort that does not weaken our networks or diminish services to the public, we support reforms to the FEHBP program to maximize participation in Medicare among eligible postal retirees. This would almost eliminate the $50 billion unfunded liability for future retiree health, while raising Medicare spending by less than 0.2% annually. Given that the Postal Service and its employees have contributed $29 billion to Medicare, this approach is fair and appropriate. Second, Congress should consider the policy that requires 100% of postal retirement funds be invested in low-yielding Treasury bonds. Together, the Civil Service and FERS postal pension accounts, along with the Postal Retiree Health Fund, hold nearly $350 billion in Treasury securities. That makes the Postal Service and its employees the 3rd largest creditors of the U.S. federal government, just behind China and Japan. No other company in America would invest its retirement assets in such an unsophisticated way, especially during a period when treasuries are yielding 2 to 4% annually. Starting with the Retiree Health Fund, we should apply private sector best practice by investing in well-diversified portfolios of private stocks, bonds, and real estate, as well as government bonds. Current policy forces the mailing industry to give Uncle Sam a low-cost loan instead of sensibly investing to cover future health care liabilities. It makes no financial sense to invest in assets that yield less than the rising cost of care. My submitted testimony makes the case for prudent investment change, addresses common objections to it, and explains how several independent agencies invest successfully in private securities. By changing the investment policy, Congress could raise the long-term rate of return on the assets, reduce the burden of pre-funding, offset the cost of postal Medicare integration, relieve upward pressure on postal rates, and reduce the misguided impulse to slash service. Third, in my full testimony, I address the postage rate making process, which the PRC will formally review in 2017. There's a remarkable degree of stakeholder consensus about the principles of successful postal reform. All four postal unions, the Postal Service, and a wide range of companies and postal trade associations have agreed on reform principles for your consideration. And these principles were outlined in a letter sent to the Chairman yesterday. And it urged legislation that would mandate postal-specific assumption, satisfy, not eliminate, satisfy the pre-funding burden by reforming FEBA to maximize Medicare participation, invest the retiree health fund sensibly, permit the Postal Service to provide non-postal products in limited circumstances, and adjust the market-dominant rate base to ensure adequate revenue through the PRC review if necessary. Our coalition's recommendations are grounded in common sense and best practice. They represent the measures on which we could agree while remaining confident that they would stabilize the Postal Service while allowing it to innovate to meet the evolving needs of our country. NALC and our sister postal unions remain committed to helping this committee find a fair and equitable path forward that does not damage our network of universal and affordable service or the employees that make that network special. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.